February 1866. The nation was still shaken by the war less than a year in the past. Thousands of the dead were still unburied. The people of the United States were trying to grasp the hell they just passed through. It was shocking then to hear that arrogant Southern elite voice, and Congressman Thomas Williams expressed that shock. They confess that they are subdued, but only, as they tell us, by the power of numbers. They do not express contrition for their great crime. They do not even admit that they have sinned. Nay, they glory in the act, treat fidelity to their infamous Confederacy as the most heroic of virtues. Two Confederate veterans were reminiscing about when Paducah was being fought over by the Northern and Southern forces. I remember, one veteran said, when we pushed those damn Yankees all the way across the Ohio and up into Illinois. The other old soldier regretfully corrected him. I was there, old friend, and I'm afraid that wasn't how it happened at all. Those Yankees drove us out of Paducah and almost to the Tennessee line. The first veteran reflected a bit and then remarked, another good story, ruined by an eyewitness. The Lost Cause myth is a lovely story, consciously invented to appeal to people steeped in European romances about knights and ladies. Though it began to be developed after the War of the Rebellion, it wasn't really perfected until well-paid writers took it on in the 1890s. Though it was a lovely story, it was designed to serve an ugly purpose, to preserve the power of a Southern elite that had shamelessly wounded their region and lost a business gamble at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. And like most romances, the story is easily ruined by eyewitnesses and facts. The story begins. In 1861, brave men from all over the southern United States joined the Confederate Army to fight for a vague but a noble cause best described as, it wasn't slavery. Ruined by an eyewitness. Every secession document mentions slavery as the main justification. The vice president of the Confederacy said enslaving Africans was the distinctive feature of the Confederacy. Later on, they talked about states' rights, but the fact is the Southern elite had been the main beneficiaries for a long time of raw federal government power, which they used to defend the slavery business. The story continues. The brave slave owners who led the fight for it wasn't what you think were supported without hesitation by almost the entire Southern population. From the beginning, slave owner leaders had serious concerns about whether they would have support from less wealthy whites. They cooked up a lot of lies to tell the white male voters of the South that the North was planning to unleash black rapists on their women, that Lincoln was elected by the black vote, which in reality was less than 1%, and that the Northern population was an alien mongrel mix of immigrants. The story continues. One wonderful aspect of the Confederacy's war was the loyalty of those back home, especially female relatives who unceasingly made flags, wore homespun dresses, and cheered on their men. As historians show, working class white women in the South resented the war that pushed them deeper into poverty, while plantation owners were protected and their men were dying in the war. In the spring of 1863, organized armed women led rebellions against high prices in several cities, from Georgia to Virginia, forcing the rebellion leadership to be more responsive to their needs and their concerns about their male relatives at war. And it goes on. Enslaved African Americans also showed deep loyalty to their owners, guarding the home places and continuing to serve their owner families. The general strike of the enslaved people, as the great historian W.B. Du Bois named it, was probably the decisive blow against the rebellion, especially when we include in it the 180,000 black men who formed the U.S. colored troops. All over the South, every time U.S. troops were nearby, people left slavery to work for them, often joining the U.S. Army forces as highly knowledgeable scouts and spies. Continuing the war was impossible with this increasingly effective internal enemy combined with a strengthened external enemy. But the story goes on. The rebellion soldiers did the very best and smartest fighting ever in history. But they were outnumbered and outspent, and in 1865, they got beat. Because even the very best fighters, fighting for the very best cause in human history, can never beat an enemy with more money, more troops, and a better industrial base. Well, the experience of the American Revolution, the Vietnam War, the Afghans fighting the Russians, the Afghans fighting the Americans, and many other stories in history suggest that the weaker force can win if it persists and fights shrewdly. The Slavery Business Rebellion, otherwise known as the Confederacy, fought big unit battles, more than guerrilla warfare. Its soldiers were constantly yearning to go home, and often they did. Back home, they probably would have fought invaders. At Appomattox, Lee still had almost 30,000 troops, and Johnston's separate force apparently totaled 90,000. A colleague suggested to Lee that he free his men to fight as guerrillas. Lee refused to do so. This was hardly the sentiment of a revolutionary nationalist. This was the realism of a man who knew that with slavery already defeated, and the real reason for the war resolved, it was time to let go of the nationhood rhetoric of the Southern elite. And it goes on. After Appomattox, corrupt white men, Northern carpetbaggers and Southern scalawags, joined with ill-prepared black men to ruin the South's economy and corrupt its politics. In fact, Reconstruction, especially the 10 years or so after 1865, was a positive period for poor and working people of both races in the South. Public schools, hospitals, and other institutions were established. But almost from the beginning, Confederate officers, former slave owners, and others from the white Southern elite attacked the state governments of Reconstruction, often violently. The major targets were black leaders and their native white allies and those who came from the North. But the story continues. In order to restore honest government and protect white womanhood, the best people of the South had to step in and take over government. Still, it took almost 25 years of struggle after U.S. troops left the South in 1877, often with biracial populist organizations doing the struggling, before the Southern white elite rule was reestablished. In every case, violence was used on behalf of the Southern white elite. Every Southern state had promised before rejoining the Union that they would protect the vote for all citizens, and every one of them broke that promise by 1905. The North, by 1877, was ready to reach out the hand of friendship to the Confederates and lay down the bloody shirt. They reached out the hand of brotherhood. In fact, brotherhood with blacks was sacrificed for white brotherhood, and white Northern business leaders, now in a position of economic dominance, were eager to have white Southern business partners. Many Northern whites were afraid if they didn't accommodate the ferocious Southern whites that there would be a new war, and increasingly they bought the racist beliefs that were being spread. The story continues. With the 20th century, a new South emerged with modern cities, factories, and a racial peace accepted by black and white Southerners. In fact, as the 20th century began, black freedom and power were all but destroyed. Jim Crow's segregation of public facilities went into full effect. Sharecropping, a system of economic control of the poorest, replaced slavery, supplemented by a cruel and racist prison system. Organized anti-black violence became a normal thing in the South, expressed both in quasi-military assaults on black communities in Atlanta, Tulsa, and elsewhere, and in lynchings, which peaked in the 1920s. Many black people moved north or west in one of the largest internal U.S. migrations. The story goes on. The celebration of the lost cause began after the Civil War and continued to be part of a Southern culture to this day, thanks to a natural feeling for heritage among Southern people. Please insert white. Ruined by an eyewitness. After the Civil War, white reactions ranged from depression and suicide to leaving the South to collaborating with the North. But as the conservative elite regained power in the 1890s, they imposed the lost cause on their fellow citizens, building monuments everywhere and making the lost cause a compulsory part of schooling and public life. The story continues. In the 1950s, Northern liberals and urban Northern blacks began to rock the boat of long-standing Southern racial peace. A powerful, dictatorial federal government interfered with the Southern states' ability to deal with their issues in the time-tested way. The fact is, black Southerners had never given up on the rights they had lost after Reconstruction. People like Rosa Parks had worked for decades to build the NAACP and other organizations. Veterans returning from World War I and World War II brought home new experiences and attitudes, and black people were keenly aware of the worldwide anti-colonial struggles, especially in Africa. Finally, in the 1950s, a new wave of freedom fighters emerged from the churches and homes of the Black South. The national government, under pressure from urban blacks and from international opinion, did not fully support the white Southern elite. Southern whites pulled out old tools, from the Confederate battle flag to murder, but still lost most of their battles. The story goes on. In an era increasingly obsessed with money and status, the sense of Confederate legacy is sadly fading. However, the Confederate flag and its noble legacy remain a way for whites, not just Southerners, to be in touch with the patriotism and the romantic spirit of the lost cause. Actually, today, more and more people recognize the shameful history of the Confederacy, pushed by the ever deeper understanding of the African Americans who built the basic economic framework of the United States in previous centuries and reworked the political framework in the 20th century. In addition, wiser Southern whites recognize that they have a lot of ancestors who lived many different life experiences, and that obsessing about 4 brief years of a losing war really doesn't do any justice to themselves or their region. Yet the story continues. The lost cause ideas provide a historical legacy of courage and discipline. Lost cause ideas, often mixed with a more modern system of racist myth like those of the Nazis, encourage a small minority's fears and hunger for authoritarian rule and even willful ignorance of history, geography, and science. If it was right to kill in a war for slavery, and then to pretend that you didn't do it, then any fantasy crusade by a tiny minority is right. If it wasn't wrong to separate families and sell them into torture, any treatment of human beings is acceptable. The evil delusions the Southern elite cultivated to protect their political power and their business interests persist. But in 1995, the largest white Protestant denomination, rooted in the South, adopted a resolution on racial reconciliation. This resolution has been carried out more in words than in action, but at least its words challenge 150 years of glorifying in sin. Some of the resolution: be it further resolved that we lament and repudiate historic acts of evil, such as slavery, from which we continue to reap a bitter harvest, and that we recognize that the racism which yet plagues our culture today, it is inextricably tied to the past, and that we resolve to apologize to all African Americans for condoning and or perpetuating individual and systematic racism in our lifetime. It's long past time for those words to have meaning in the white South, for white Southerners to give up delusions that they have some kind of positive legacy in the rebellion. We white people have been in the South for 4 centuries. During that time, we participated actively in the two great sins of our nation, the theft from the native peoples and the harm to African Americans. But for every moment that one of our ancestors took up arms, there were months and even years when they baked bread, loved their children, gave alms, told stories, sang songs, plowed the soil, gathered the harvest, struggled with the great responsibility of worship. Like every group of people on the face of the earth, Southern whites' wealth of legacy is in sustained family and community, not in one or two bold moments by bold men. And of course, the wealth of the community has never been solely white, but shared. It is long past time to set aside sin and seek our true legacy.